everyone, and welcome back to Pain Exchange, a monthly podcast from the International Association for the Study of Pain, highlighting global innovations in pain research and amplifying the voices of our diverse membership. A hot topic in the field of pain research right now is one that's on everybody's minds: artificial intelligence. The AI landscape has been booming over the past year, and almost everywhere you look, there is a new AI tool popping up to solve daily tasks, as well as answer some bigger questions. The number of AI-based decision support tools, such as those being used by U.S. healthcare providers, have risen exponentially within the past year. To help me understand how AI could impact the field of pain research and management, I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Daniel Buchman, Senior Scientist at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, Canada's largest mental health teaching hospital, and one of the world's leading research centers. And to give a patient perspective on the issue, we are joined by Joletta Belton, a dedicated patient advocate and founding co-chair of IASP's Global Alliance of Partners for Pain Advocacy. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Renee.
Pleasure to be here.
So it feels like AI has kind of exploded since the beginning of 2025. So Dan, you know about AI and pain. How did you get into this kind of technology?
How did I get into it? I don't know how into it I am, but I'm definitely intrigued by it. So I think like most people, AI was popping up everywhere, right? And as a bioethicist, a lot of these new technologies started to raise really interesting questions for me. So, how are they going to affect our day-to-day lives? How are they going to, change the way that we think about machines and intelligence? But also like really important ethics questions around privacy, around how should we interact with this technology? Who benefits from this technology? And who might be harmed? And of course, we're talking about AI, we're talking about a whole broad range of systems and tools, and there's a lot of things that fall under that, under what might be considered AI or machine learning, et cetera. And so I was particularly interested in how this was affecting the health domain. And in my area of research, so I look at ethics in mental health, substance use, and chronic pain. And I was really interested in how, in the pain context, how these tools were being potentially applied. So, what were they being used for? Why did people want to develop AI systems or AI tools in the pain context? And for what purpose? Was it to better help predict, diagnose, and treat chronic pain? Was it something that is going to help with self-management of pain? Is it going to better identify symptoms or predict the onset of pain flare-ups before they occur, right? I was interested in a lot of research around using novel technologies like brain imaging to identify so-called objective clinical biomarkers of pain. And so I was interested in how are these technologies, intersecting with some of those research efforts as well. And so, that was sort of my main interest in how I got involved, but also just as a citizen and understanding these bigger questions about the role of AI in society and how it might be influencing or shaping democracy, and how we participate and engage with each other. But anyway, there's a lot of sort of questions here that I'm keen on.
So how have you seen the pain field starting to incorporate AI?
So I've seen the pain field start to incorporate AI in a few different ways, and I'll try to give sort of a very high-level summary of what those might be as I understand it. So in the first area that I've started to see is around pain assessment and objective recognition. So many of these AI systems are being developed to measure and assess pain more objectively than traditional self-reports. As listeners of this podcast know very well, there are no objective or objective medical tests that can both detect and measure pain, although this has been a long-standing interest of the pain field. And so folks need to rely on subjective report or patient or person testimony about their experiences. And this has caused a lot of frustration, I'll say, in the pain world, amongst people who live with pain, family members, healthcare professionals, and scientists, because, pain does not necessarily have a corresponding physical sign that can capture what it's like to be in pain. So this has motivated this huge part of pain research. And so some of these technologies are trying to analyze facial expressions or other physiological signals using machine learning and other deep learning models. And this can be sort of factored under the AI umbrella. So, for example, like machine learning models might classify pain intensity or try to detect pain from patterns in these facial cues, use things like EEG or ECG, like electrocardiogram or other data. And some folks have said, well, we want to develop a lot of these tools because some people actually can't self-report their pain. So, for example, if people have cognitive impairment. Another area where I'm seeing some of this come up is in predictive analytics and around personal pain prognoses. So this is trying to develop AI tools to forecast pain progression and treatment response. And this is by using very large data sets, or what's sometimes called big data, from electronic health records, various forms of sensors, and as well as patient histories. So what might happen in this context is machine learning models might analyze various patterns to predict who is likely to develop chronic pain, let's say after an acute injury, or might be most likely to experience pain flare-ups, and what treatments are most likely to work for this person. Other areas are around AI-powered digital therapeutics and behavioral support. So how AI might be integrated into various digital health tools to support people who live with pain through various cognitive or like psychological or behavioral interventions. So what we see here are things around maybe some chatbots or other AI-guided apps that deliver or might augment various psychological therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. There might be tools that help to educate about pain, provide coping strategies. Others are looking at symptom tracking as well. So what are some of the patterns and triggers that people might experience using different types of data? So various pain scores, like we know of like the 1 to 10 pain scale, or what's sometimes called the FACES pain scale. Again, these are subjective reports. People might report their mood at various points of the day, their activity level, any medication use or medications that they might be taking for their pain. And it could provide potentially some actionable insights for people. So, for example, saying, well, you had a bad sleep last night, and so this will predict a flare-up for you, 24 to 48 hours later. There's personal activity, exercise programs, other using trying to enhance diagnostic accuracy for interpreting complex medical images and other physiological data that could be linked to pain scores. There's some work going on, again, in drug discovery as well, right? So looking at using AI to accelerate drug discovery, to find various potential treatments for pain, non-opioid related treatments for pain that may be helpful for people who might have a difficult time taking opioids for whatever reason that might be. And, so that's very, again, high level of the different kinds of areas that AI is involved in. And I will just want to emphasize, though, that this is very preliminary and early days. A lot of this is still in the research development stage, although I know there probably are some companies that have begun to implement some of these apps and tools. But again, the evidence is still sort of to be determined, and but it's a big sort of area of research, particularly around trying to promote objectivity in pain management.
Nice. And Joe, as someone living with pain, do any of these tools seem like they would be helpful for you, for your doctors?
Oh, there's so many things out there, as Daniel was just talking about. So many tools that are being developed at all sorts of different levels and directed towards different parts of the, clinical encounter, from, tools that are supposed to make things like scribing easier and taking patient histories and that sort of stuff, to tools that are potentially targeted or marketed directly towards people living with pain, like self-management tools and things like that. I think across this broad spectrum, there's definitely things that could potentially help people with pain. The thing, and not to always be negative, but the thing that I worry the most about is who is developing the tools, solving for what problem, and who identified that problem, and on what data are those tools being developed on. As Daniel pointed out, like big data, like there's they're pulling information from these large data sets, that those data sets were typically created by either researchers or by clinicians, and there's very little patient input to that. So it's always through this clinical or research lens that this data was originally developed by. And there could be things like inherent biases or stigma or discriminatory language built into the data itself that could be perpetuated by tools. They've shown in some large language models that have been used in like mental health, for example, that certain conditions are stigmatized more than others. Like alcoholism is stigmatized more than depression, say. So some of those things can be perpetuated by AI dependent on the data that we're using and who created that data and who is now using that data to create the tool. I don't know if I'm being clear about that, but those are the things that I think about. Like, can this tool be helpful? Yeah, maybe for a person living with pain, but who created the tool and for what reason? And who was involved in the development of that tool? Who identified that problem in the first place as a problem that was worthy of being solved by AI? What data was it based on? All of those sorts of questions I think we always need to be asking to ensure that the tools that we're using aren't proliferating or perpetuating stigma and bias that might already be built into the data. And instead, we're building tools that ameliorate bias and stigma and those kind of negative aspects of pain care that people living with pain already experience. We don't want to keep perpetuating those things. And if AI tools can solve for some of those things, that would be great. But I have concerns that they're not going to.
Yeah. So a question, I guess, for the both of you is, how do you think we can avoid all of these biases and stigmas that using these AI tools could possibly perpetuate? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, I'll jump in, and it's a drum that I beat all the time. But I think that if a tool is being developed for a specific community, like people with arthritis or people who need to self-manage their pain, or people who are taking medication and it's around taking that medication consistently, that those people, whatever community the tool is being devised for, in a diverse group of people from that community need to be involved in that process so that we can reduce the number of areas where we might not see where bias can creep in or stigma can creep in, or the way that language is used can perpetuate things like stigma and discrimination or bias towards people. So I think having a diverse group of people from the community that the tool is targeted toward, or if it's a tool targeted towards clinicians to help them with administrative tasks and things like that, the ultimate population being affected is still the patient population. So people with lived experience of the conditions that are being targeted through the tools need to be involved in the process. And I will die on that hill.
And so at what point in the process should patients be involved?
I think from identifying what questions need to be answered in the first place, all the way through to implementation and testing the products in the real world, and everywhere at every step along that process too, because we don't know what we don't know until somebody points it out to us. And it's often somebody with a different skill set, a different experience, a different educational background, different experiences going through the health system and what they've faced and what they could potentially inform developers of these tools that patients or people in the real world are facing in, clinical care or out in society, if it's about like self-management and the things that they are targeting towards people living with pain, and they want them to do these things to help them self-manage their pain. But what does that look like in the real world? And how can people living with pain inform that process? And this isn't just good for the people living with pain. It doesn't just make things more equitable or potentially reduce the chance for stigma and these sorts of things. It's better for the researchers and developers of these tools too, because it's probably going to be more successful if real world input is involved from the very beginning, rather than trying to implement something in the real world that was never tested or developed with that population in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with what Joletta is saying here. I think it's really critical for AI across the health spectrum, no matter the condition or the issue, is that the people who are most affected by the condition are involved right from the get-go in terms of developing that. And as Joletta said, just like what questions do developers and researchers and others need to be asking, right? And who is it being developed for? I think that's critical. But I also I would add to that as well in saying, like, bias has become is a huge issue in AI ethics, and I think it's a critically important issue. But one, I think that has had a lot of focus and attention, maybe to the expense of some others as well, but not to say that it's not critical. But I worry that there's sort of this idea that we can somehow eliminate bias, and I don't think we ever can. And I think for a few reasons. One of them is that, we talk about AI being trained on data sets or biased data sets, and that's because human beings are inherently biased. And we are biased in our language. We are biased in our actions, even if we're not being very direct about it. There's systemic and structural issues which go into how the data is collected, what kind of information is being documented, and how things are showing up. And then we're training our AI systems on these biased data sets. The philosopher Shannon Valor has a wonderful book out called The AI Mirror, which I absolutely love, and we'll give a plug for that here, saying, well, AI is a reflection back on us, on who we are as human beings. It's not something, it is us, right? It is that reflection. And I think we need to keep that in mind. And, there is a move in the pain field and also outside of the pain field to create, what's sometimes called fair algorithms, or in the case where, some algorithms have been noted to be racist, so to speak, to have sort of so-called race neutral algorithms. And I think that's important, and those are very good intentions, but I don't think we should fool ourselves that we could actually have things that are race neutral or gender neutral and so forth. And because what it ends up happening, even despite the good intentions of all folks involved, I think what ends up happening is we treat certain things like race or gender as a variable. And so people might take those variables out of the data set, but the issue isn't race. The issue is racism. The issue isn't gender, it's sexism. And so these are things that cannot necessarily be reduced to computations. These are things that are embedded in how we interact with each other as human beings. And so the idea, I think, that AI may be able to correct for these broader social, structural issues that are a huge issue in pain management and the history of pain management, as folks know well, I think we have to be very careful in thinking that an AI can solve this massive problem for us. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and I don't think it shouldn't mean that we should not be attentive to it out in the algorithmic context, but I think we should look at these broader social forces, if you will, that are contributing to inequities, let's say, in race-based treatment, in pain management, in why there's so many issues related to gender in the context of pain, and taking, for example, women's pain seriously, and how those identities intersect with other forms of disadvantage, which has sort of manifested sort of throughout history in the context of pain.
I agree with all of that. And also just add too that while we're looking at those more systemic things like racism, and definitely AI is not going to solve for that, just adding to that too, the data that we have is often from populations that are not representative of the total population. And that's problematic. And that was more of the bias that I was referring to. A lot of the biobanks are very disproportionate in terms of the populations that live in those areas, or the population that lives in those areas is not represented in the biobank or like tissue bank data, those sorts of things. Even in the way that we do research, it's populations that live near, academic research centers that are studied. So there's a lot of populations that aren't studied just because they are not in proximity to a research center or an academic institution, or the populations that live in proximity to an academic research center, but they don't have things like childcare or transportation. So it's a very self-selected population that can even participate in studies in the first place. So we're basing a lot of our norms in the data on a very select population that's not representative of the entire population. And I think that that's really important for us to consider too. If we're pulling from existing data, where does that existing data come from? And what biases are built into that data beyond the systemic issues, very serious issues like sexism and racism and those sorts of things, to just those self-selected populations that can even participate in a research study in the first place, which tend to be whiter, wealthier.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is spot on, and I think this has been an issue that has plagued like clinical trials and others, as you know, like for many years, right? It's from a research design perspective, it's like a person with like one issue, right, can participate in this drug trial because we don't have any of these confounders that might influence the results of this medication that we're testing. But meanwhile, what person has one issue?
Yeah,
and particularly in pain, right? Like people with pain, like living with pain, often have multiple, multimorbidity, and multimorbidity is the norm. And so I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's like many of these data sets are built on these studies and other things of a very sort of selective biased population that doesn't necessarily represent the person that might be in front of them.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, we have all those issues like people with chronic pain, especially facing discrimination and racism and sexism in their care. So it's bad things built upon bad things. But like even like me, I wouldn't be able to participate in most clinical trials because I have a history of breast cancer now too. And because just by having had breast cancer and being treated for breast cancer, I'm not eligible for what is often referred to as like non-cancer chronic pain because I'm still in active treatment. I wouldn't be able to participate, and the cancer rates are going up. So there's going to be a lot of people who are excluded from just chronic pain trials if you've had chronic pain and cancer, even though the two things are not related. Like my chronic pain issues aren't related to my breast cancer diagnosis at all. But so that there's a lot of things, Renee.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard that so AI is being trained on data. And one thing researchers always talk about is if you put garbage data in, you're going to get garbage conclusions out. And so it seems like, especially in AI, this is really important because AI is not showing you the sources of where they're getting their information. It's just showing you information.
That's why I always think it's really interesting to delve deeper. What problem is this tool solving for? Who developed the tool and with who? Who was excluded from the development of that tool? And like who benefits from it? I think we need to be asking those questions like over and over and over again because AI has become a lot easier, especially in the last year. Like one of the things that I recently heard too is if you are doing, and I feel bad for researchers, like if you're basing research on large language models that were developed a year ago, things are so much different just a year later that your results will probably be a lot different, or the tool that you develop will probably be a lot different just because the models are so much different in just a year's time. So this is evolving like faster than we can even keep up with. But I think we always need to come back to those questions. Like, what problem is this even solving for? And who benefits from solving for that problem? Who identified that problem in the first place? And a lot of times it's probably not this benevolent person who's trying to like improve chronic pain for people. It's people who want to have a successful tech company, or which doesn't have to necessarily be a bad motivation. It's just, what are the motivations behind it? Who is funding it? All of those sorts of questions I think are really important. And who was a part of the process and who was excluded from that process? Because there is so much, like Daniel's overview of all of the different ways that AI is being used right now, all of these issues that we've just identified with current practice of pain care that all of this is being based on. Like we just really need to be intentional about the questions that we ask, about the tools that are being developed, and who gets to identify what problems are being solved for. Like a lot of times problems are being solved for that might not need to be problems in the first place. We talked about this before we started the interview. A lot of it is about system overload. Health systems are trying to prevent system overload by developing these tools, but the system itself could prevent some of that overload. If clinicians don't have enough time with their patients, the system could provide more time for their clinicians to have with their patients without having to develop an AI tool to solve for some other part of that process. So I think that we just need to keep coming back to questioning what these things are being built for, especially because there's going to be a massive proliferation of these tools across the board directed towards all sorts of different populations, researchers, manuscript writers, clinicians, patients. the proliferation of these tools is going to be massive in the years to come.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I think, as an ethicist, these are some of the questions that keep me up at night that you're asking, Joletta. And I worry about that too. And I think we should be asking these questions about AI in terms of, okay, so what is this problem that we're trying to solve? And there's so much hype around AI. It's new, it's shiny, it's flashy, it's the future. And I think given that, unbridled enthusiasm amongst some, there may be, sort of keen efforts to sort of see AI as a hammer, and everything else is a nail. And it's like, and so, folks have termed this like a techno fix or techno solutionism. And is this something that we need to use AI for? Is it actually going to help us make more effective decisions in healthcare or in pain management? Is it going to help us make more efficient decisions in pain management? And is it going to help us make more equitable decisions in pain management? And this sort of, effectiveness, efficacy, and equity is a sort of framework that I'm borrowing from the philosopher Alex John London, who's written about some of these things. And I think these are really critical questions that we need to ask. Like, are these actually going to lead to better outcomes? I would also say, like, what's the cost? Because sometimes these tools, just to develop them, can be massive amounts of money, let alone the potential energy output that's involved in developing many of these AI systems, as well as the amount of water that's required, right? The climate impacts actually of developing these tools are something we don't, I think, talk enough about. And then, Joletta, to your point as well, it's like, well, who's developing it and why? And, is there potential financial interests here that might be motivating the design? Doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, but sometimes, as we know from other areas, from tech, from pharma, from others, sometimes these financial primary interests might, in some cases, be at a higher level than other interests, such as improving patient care. Doesn't mean they can't exist both, but patient care should, from my perspective, should always be primary. But sometimes financial interests can get into tension or into conflict with some of these, right? And also for, a lot of health systems or hospitals or healthcare centers that are engaging in partnerships with developers or other vendors, right? And, how are patient healthcare data being protected? Did patients consent to have their data from their electronic health records, including their data about their pain and their treatment for pain, being sold maybe to a developer to train models, right? Exactly. So I think this is also like another really important question we need to be asking.
Yeah, exactly. Is where is this data going? Because a lot of AI tools, they'll say that they're learning based on the people using the tool. But somebody has to own that data, right? That data has to be going somewhere. And I wonder how we can help as researchers protect the privacy of these patients that we're making these tools for.
I think that's an important question to ask too. And it's not just researchers who are developing these tools. It's a lot of people outside of the pain kind of ecosphere, outside of pain research, outside of pain clinical care and health systems that are developing these tools. People who don't have, backgrounds in medicine that are developing a lot of these tools and might not be familiar with things like HIPAA and how to protect data and de-identifying data and that sort of thing. And that's really concerning. People who might not be they're operating from more of like a business ethos than a healthcare ethos. Yeah. And I think that matters too.
Yeah. Because in medical school, in science, you're always taught the implications of what releasing this data could do. But in a business context, you're only taught that
get as much data as you can.
Exactly. But it can actually be really detrimental to have all of this patient data in one place, in this one source, So how do you think we can protect against that?
I think we need guardrails. We need legal solutions. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't speak specifically to some of those, but I would say that we need to have very strong legal protections for health data, for other forms of personal data. I think the question you asked about who owns the data, I think is a really important question. It's one that's been part of the history of bioethics about, who owns your data. Is it you? Is it, can you consent to give it away, and for how long and for what purposes, and so forth, even for ones you may not have imagined in the future. So I think these are questions that we need sort of urgent solutions to. And I worry about this too, because, a lot of, let's say, large language models that might be available for free right now, whether in sort of app form or online, that people aren't paying for, well, they are paying for it maybe in different ways, but are readily giving up a lot of their personal information very freely to these apps out of curiosity, out of, intrigue. It's like, oh, what is this? But also, like, I think in the context of like health apps, or even in pain apps too, it's like, people want help. People want solutions. People are saying, hey, someone's saying that this thing here is going to help me. Well, then yeah, I'll give my data and I don't care. And maybe they don't, or maybe they understand, the potential implications of doing so, or that, if you are not paying for it, you are the data. I'm butchering that line or whatever.
If you're not paying for it, you're the product.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. Yeah, no, for my inarticulate attempt at paraphrasing that. But so I mean, I think that's the thing. And so people might be, or at least some people might be in a very vulnerable spot. And especially if they're really suffering and are looking for anything that might help. And so as a result, it puts them at a potential greater risk of privacy breaches. It puts them at a potential greater risk of other, harms coming their way by releasing some of this data and having it connected with other systems or other apps. And so that's why I think we need very, very strong protections. In the health context, we have very rigorous requirements for testing and evaluating the medications that we take and we consume. Also for devices that are used in, let's say, surgical contexts, right? Drugs and devices. Why do we not have very strong regulations and requirements for quality and safety around the use of these technologies that are being applied in health contexts in the same way? So that I worry about that.
So all of that, all of our privacy worries aside, Joletta, you are very involved in patient advocacy and involving people living with pain in the tool development research process. How can people with lived experience of pain market themselves? Say, like, I'm willing to participate and I'm willing to help. How can these two groups kind of meet?
I don't know if I want people with pain putting themselves out there in at least in a way where anyone can pick up on them for all these reasons that Daniel just said.
Safe ways for them to do it.
Ways. One way through IASP is through GAPA, as we're expanding our membership now. If there are audience members that don't know, the Global Alliance of Partners for Pain Advocacy is started as a task force of IASP, but we are growing our membership now, and it's free for people with lived experience of pain to join, even if you're not an IASP member. And then IASP members who are interested in partnering with people with lived experience of pain can join GAPA as well through their membership portal on IASP. I think that's one way that we can begin connecting people with lived experience of pain with researchers and, educators, academics, clinicians to start having these conversations about how we can do this better. Because one of the things that I think is so important is the relationship building that happens before any of the work is even done. So if AI tools are going to be developed and people with pain are going to be a part you just can't jump into a project. There has to be trust built between those two groups of folks beforehand. So I think that joining organizations like that, or depending on what country you're in, if there is a patient or lived experience group as a part of the regional, pain society, like the Canadian Pain Society has a lived experience group. USASP has lived experience members now. The British Pain Society has a patient voice group. There's a lot of pain societies now that have patient or lived experience groups within them that I think through
Canadian Pain Society. Sorry to interrupt. Just want as a Canadian on the call, I just want to add the Canadian.
I said Canadian.
Oh, you did? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, my apologies. I completely missed that.
But yeah, so I think going through those like established established societies are one way of starting to get involved in the research process. And then even like through connecting with people on LinkedIn, and I'm not on social media anymore for lots of reasons that we've talked about here. But I think that's one way. I think we just need to start having more conversations between all parties, developers of these tools, researchers who are studying these tools, clinicians who might use these tools, people with pain who might use these tools or be a part of clinical care where these tools are used, all need to start having conversations to even identify the problems that we should be solving for, and then how do we best go about solving for those problems and co-developing and the ideas for that and co-producing the solutions and then co-delivering whatever's developed to test it and determine if it's worthwhile. I just like those guardrails and quality control. Like one of my worries is it's just going to be a race to get tools out there as fast as possible to be first to market, and that those sort of things where quality kind of goes by the wayside in an attempt to be first or best. And I think that we really need to be deliberate and intentional and come together and have conversations to see where we can take all of this and then see what's born of that. And I think the more deliberate and intentional and inclusive we are, the better tools will come of it that will have more sustaining power, potentially be more equitable, more scalable to more places and that sort of thing.
And scalable equals more revenue, right? It should follow.
I would hope so. But I mean, there's a lot of junk out there. There's already a lot of junk out there. And it's just really not good. Like I'm beta testing some stuff just through Fitbit, like a Fitbit coach, just because I was curious about it. Like Daniel said, people might do it. I'm the product because I'm doing this for free. I am definitely the product in this mix. And I can confirm that even with a lot of money, because Fitbit's owned by Google now, even a lot of money thrown behind it, they're not very good at what they're coming up with yet. At least not when it comes to like working. As someone with a strength and conditioning background, they're not that great yet. And I think that there's just a lot of poor quality stuff going on right now.
Yeah. And I feel like that's because you're having engineers and tech designers completing like a research job.
Yeah, I mean, I think, what's another thing that's interesting to me is, and Joletta mentioned this as well, is sort of the motivations. And we kind of started off with this about I think the biggest area of AI, broadly speaking, use in pain management context is around this piece around objectivity, or trying to increase the sort of like being able to measure pain objectively, to sort of quantify pain more. And that's because I think, for a very, very long time in medicine, in Western context, there's this sort of high degree of intolerance for subjectivity. And pain is, by definition, a subjective experience. And so as an ethicist, I think a lot about, well, there's all these programs of research by very well-meaning, intended, brilliant scientists on trying to overcome what's perceived as limitations of subjectivity. But I think, maybe that's the issue in the first place, is that maybe we should listen to people more. Maybe we should think about, taking people at their word. And I'm not saying that there aren't clinicians that don't do that. I know there's some excellent clinicians that do. But I think, pain and chronic pain is interesting in that way, in that it sort of frustrates this biomedical culture that we work in. And, is this the problem that we need to overcome? Yeah, I can see potential benefit for people who may be non-communicative, may have challenges with verbal communication or even facial communication, for sure. But, I think why this is a persistent problem in pain. And maybe it's not that problem that we need to overcome necessarily, and then to some of the further questions that we were asking at the beginning, like who benefits and who's harmed, right? Mike, what happens if there's a discrepancy between the AI output and what the person's saying about their pain? How will that be managed? Does AI have this authority over, the clinical wisdom, the clinical experience and expertise, and also the patient's lived experience and expertise about their own condition, right? So I think there's really important considerations for practice there. And then what do we know already about people who are not taken seriously about their pain, and how might AI actually, if used in this context, make these people even worse off? So ethically, that.
So you were saying that the objective diagnosis, the objective marker of pain is what some of these AI tools are being used for. Is there a way that the user could actually insert some subjectivity? Could someone train the AI tool to be a little bit more subjective, to think a little less subjectively?
So I think one thing that AI won't be able to do is to understand what it is like for that person to live with pain. So I think if these tools are ultimately used and developed in a pain management context, I think what's going to be really important is how they're used and how they're used to support conversations between people who are living with pain and their healthcare professionals, right? It's not that it would replace any one particular perspective, although I could see, situations where there might be a deference to the output. And that's sort of the situations where I worry a little bit about. But really, if it's going to be used productively, it could be used as part of shared decision-making, ideally in collaboration, and saying like, hey, is this reflective of what it is like for you or your experience? And have the opportunity for the person who's in pain to contribute to that discussion, saying, actually, no, this doesn't, or yes, it does. And I think in that way, depending on how, whatever tool it might be is used, could it be able to include, patient testimony and that patient experience in a productive and thoughtful way. And that's not all, I'm talking about sort of a potential AI use case here in one situation about, trying to measure pain intensity or trying to, identify, a brain-based biomarker of chronic pain. There may be other really interesting ways that AI could be used in a pain context that doesn't necessarily attend to those worries that I just talked about. It could be, maybe in developing better treatments. It could be maybe recommending management plans based on a whole wide range of data that the patient or the person who's in pain themselves could contribute to and have some somewhat control over, what's being included in that. So I think, in addition to like info from the electronic health record. So I think there's potential uses there should the evidence demonstrate, effectiveness and so forth. So yeah, I think it's how this ends up being rolled out will be sort of true importance.
I was just thinking, so when Daniel was talking about, that crisis of trust that we already have when it comes to chronic pain and people with chronic pain in the clinical encounter, Ben Darlow and I just recently published a viewpoint in JOSPT where we asked, do we trust people with pain and what would happen if we did? Because it seems like we have a distrust as default framework when it comes to chronic or ongoing pain, where that person with pain has to prove that they're in pain, usually to multiple clinicians over time. And in having to prove their pain, they're having to prove their worth as a human being, that they're a trustworthy human being, that they're being honest about their experiences. So there's this huge, bar that people with pain have to jump over to even be considered trustworthy in the clinical environment a lot of times, especially if they've been in pain for a long time and treatments haven't been successful in the past. What I was just thinking about with that discussion that just took place, like what if we developed AI tools where trust was the default, where it was a trust the person in pain is the default framework that we're operating within whatever tool is being developed. So none of that distrust is baked into those systems, and what could come of that? It would be really interesting to me to see in writing about our paper. I thought it was kind of hyperbole for me to think of it like this trust as default as like revolutionary, but I honestly think that it would. And one of the commenters actually said like trust as default would be a revolution. I'm like, I'm not the only one that thinks this. That it would probably be revolutionary in AI tools too. That rather than we need an objective marker, the AI, helps us figure out to prove someone's pain or verify someone's pain. And like Daniel said, it could be very helpful in circumstances where people can't verbalize their pain or they can't, communicate their pain in other ways. But what if we just started as trust as the default? I believe this person in pain and what they're telling me, and then, go from there. But building a tool from the ground up where that trust is built in, that would be a really interesting experiment.
Yeah, I agree. That'd be great in general. I think if we started with a default position of trust in pain context, because you're right. I think pain is a sort of somewhat of a unique context where the patient has to demonstrate their trustworthiness to the healthcare professional and not the other way around, where it's like, no, I'm credible about my experiences. I have integrity. I'm not lying, right? And this is, what other sort of context do people have to do that? And again, this gets back to the subjectivity thing. And we know that certain populations are more, disadvantaged here in terms of having to demonstrate their trustworthiness, or assumptions about distrust pervades them as part of like any identities or populations that they're part of. So I think it'd be really interesting to sort of see what that might, look like. Starting from a default position of trust. And I think that would go a long way. But again, that's maybe easier said than done, but I would love to see that.
So Joe had actually said this during the webinar version of this discussion, that in a lot of AI models, they're sort of trained to tell the user what they want to hear. So how do you think that would work with this AI context?
That's what people are saying about that one JAMA study, that AI is more empathetic. But it wasn't people with pain or people with health conditions that actually made that determination. It was healthcare experts that made that determination. And when I went into the actual scripts that they used, I hated the chatbot responses because it's just a bunch of word salad, and it's telling people what they think I think people want to hear. But in that context, like Reddit, people aren't looking for word salad, empathy, all that kind of stuff. They just want a very clear, direct answer.
I think the AI sycophancy problem is an important one. That's how these tools are designed. And some of the newer large language models, I think, you can maybe modify it a little bit to be not so reinforcing. But it's designed that way so you're kept engaged, because people want you online longer or engaged with the systems longer. So it's no question. So, is that an issue for some chatbots in the pain context? I don't know. Is it reinforce and maybe in some ways that might be a potential good thing. I have no idea. Reinforcing, certain behaviors, but maybe not all behaviors. I don't know. I think this is an important research question. Perhaps some folks have looked into it. I don't know, but I think generally I have a lot of worries about that sort of design with these large language models, particularly given someone who worked in psychiatric or mental health ethics.
Yeah, exactly. It was just when you guys were talking about trust being the default, I was actually thinking AI kind of already does that. They kind of already really trust you, or I guess just try to reinforce what you're already telling it. But it is to kind of keep you online because you are the product.
But so I think that's an interesting thing though. So if you're the person with pain interacting with it and it trusts you, but what if you're the clinician interacting with the AI tool and trust isn't your default? Because I think we do operate within a trust or distrust as default mechanism. But I can tell you just from my Fitbit AI coach experience too, they are very, I can't say the word, sycophantic, obsequious. They just are blowing smoke up your ass all the time with a bunch of word salad telling you how awesome you are. And I'm like, please stop doing that. I'm arguing with my AI coach. I'm like, this is not what I want from a coach. That's not what coaches do.
Yeah. Tell me I need to get up.
And it is a bunch of word salad a lot of time.
Wow. After all of that, is there anything else you'd like to talk about? Any other aspects of AI you guys would like to delve into?
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground, and again, thank you for the opportunity to chat about this. I think it's really, really critical that we ask these hard questions, that we think really hard about it, and we consider about who's benefiting and who's harming from the use of these technologies. And, we always want it to be for patient benefit to be primary, but there's a lot of competing interests here. And I do think there's a lot of, there's some opportunity here for certain types of use cases of AI in pain management that could provide some benefit. But there's some of the other ones that we've covered here today, I have some concerns about, also particularly from an ethics perspective.
And for me, I would just leave it with, before you trust your AI tool, just trust the person with pain sitting in front of you.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you both so much for talking with me today. And I know I'll definitely be talking with you more. And I can't wait to work with you guys again.
Thanks, Renee.
Thanks so much.